Should we be trying to remove thoughts during meditation? Some people say no, that's not the point. But the Buddha actually recommended a practice of removing thoughts that we'll discuss coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel. And if you want a deeper dive into material of early Buddhism, check out onlinedharma.org and the new courses I have up there. Much of the practice that we are taught in contemporary Buddhist meditation involves what we might call a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment, of whatever is going on right now. And that is a practice of mindfulness meditation, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's a great practice. It's the one that's really focused upon by most meditation teachers. But there are other forms of meditation practice in early Buddhism. In particular, there are practices of concentration meditation that lead to states called the jhanas, which are states of absorptive meditation in which feelings of joy and happiness arise seemingly spontaneously within us. Now, both of these practices can be useful, and indeed they do need to be, to a certain extent, unified in order to really get far along the path. At least that's the picture we get in early Buddhism. Now, a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment is what allows us to understand our minds, to understand the way that our minds work. And that's a great practice. Indeed, it's a necessary, an essential practice. But it's idle unless we put it to work. In other words, unless we take that understanding of the mind and use it to help us to, let's say, nourish our more skillful tendencies and denourish our less skillful tendencies. That's the heart of right effort, of a practice of effort that will make us better in the sense of having happier lives, having better lives, having more skillful lives, creating less harm in the world and less harm to ourselves. So what we want to do is to try to find ways in general to, but the understanding is to purify our mind stream, as it's sometimes described, to purify the way we think, to purify our thoughts, to make ourselves think in more skillful and better ways. And much of this purification happens by itself. It simply happens as we view the mind stream, as we are attentive to the present moment, seeing things arise and pass. The mind stream actually does become purified over time because we become aware of the character of skillful and unskillful mental states. And that is in general the process. But it doesn't always work perfectly. And indeed, particularly if what we're trying to do is to concentrate, is to come into a sort of a concentration meditation practice, then passing difficulties in thoughts, passing obsessions, can disrupt our attempts to become concentrated, our attempts to reach deeper states of calm in meditation. And in one sutta, the Buddha actually gave us 5 different methods for removing these kinds of unwanted thoughts. But the Buddha said at the beginning of this sutta, that this is intended for people who are practicing for the higher mind. That is to say, they're meditators or meditative practitioners with some skill, with some practice under their belts already. They're not beginners. And so these are understood within the tradition to be relatively advanced practices. Although they may seem not so advanced when I discuss them, I think we have to reconsider. That is to say, there are difficulties with all of them, which I'll get to at the end, and part of the reason why I think these should be considered relatively advanced practices, in certain respects anyhow, and not sort of indulge in willy-nilly, especially the last one, as you'll see. But first, to outline the issue, the unskillful thoughts that we're having problems with, that are obsessing the mind, are thoughts that revolve around desire, that is greed in certain respects, that revolve around hatred or ill will, and that revolve around delusion or ignorance in certain respects. And those are the traditional 3 fires or 3 poisons that we're trying to rid our mind of. And the problem is, of course, these do arise from time to time. That's just what it is to be human. But the problem is when they obsess the mind to some degree. That is, when they keep returning, a particular thought keeps returning that has one of these three characters. So the first strategy that the Buddha recommends is a strategy of substitution, where we work to substitute a more pleasant, a better, a more skillful mental state for one that is unpleasant or unskillful in this respect. And here, and in all of these cases, the Buddha gives similes that will help illustrate the kind of idea he has. And in this case, he gives the simile of a carpenter who is faced with a piece of furniture that is joined with wooden pegs, and there's a wooden peg that's rotten, that's decayed, and as a result, the wooden table, let's say, is falling apart. And in this case, the Buddha says the carpenter will take a fresh peg and put it over the wooden peg and hammer it in so that the fresh peg pushes the rotten peg out of the piece of furniture, leaving it whole and new. And this is the idea where we're substituting good thoughts for bad. We're hammering out the bad thoughts with the good thoughts. And we may think of examples such as somebody who has obsessive desire, a particular kind of obsession, wanting something, a particular car or a vacation or another person perhaps. And this desire is obsessing the mind. It's not useful. It's getting in the way of meditation. And so they might use meditation on impermanence, on unsatisfactoriness in some respect. They might think about the fact that these things are not going to be around forever, that they have their own troubles involved with them. And that kind of thinking, that's more skillful kind of thinking, a more wise thinking, may help to drive that thought out of the mind. Or if it comes to, I should say, one of the most paradigmatic cases here is where we're obsessed with ill will or anger. And in order to push that thought out of the mind, we replace it with thoughts of metta, of loving kindness. So we practice kind thoughts towards people. We start with thoughts for people that we have no problem thinking kind thoughts about, by people who are close to us, who we like or love or respect in great ways. And then we work towards the problematic person little by taking people who are a little farther away from us. But the idea here is to substitute a skillful thought for an unskillful thought. Now, when it comes to ignorance or delusive thoughts, where let's say we're having some kinds of questions about our practice, well, then the right thing to do might be to think about ways of solving that problem. Maybe going and getting help or something. That's the kind of thing we might do. Now, the second practice for ridding ourselves of these kinds of problematic thoughts is one of recognizing the danger in them. And here the Buddha gives a very strong simile. The Buddha says, think of a young person who is very interested in ornamentation, who wants to look beautiful, who wants to be very stylishly dressed. Think of how they would react if you put around their necks a dead snake or a dead dog or a dead person. Very strong simile. He says that they would be repulsed, they'd be disgusted, they would be humiliated by that. And he says we should think in the same respect about these kinds of thoughts within us, that they have aspects of that impact both two words in Pali called hiri and ottappa, which basically mean, hiri means our sense of self-respect, our sense of moral rightness about ourselves, that we have too much respect to dangle around our necks thoughts of hatred or thoughts of greed. And ottappa is this other aspect of our own personal kind of ethical system, where we are concerned with how other people will think of us, of our concern over the dangers that we will face of the thoughts of others. So if we do bad things in the world, if we entertain thoughts that are unhealthy for us, then it's going to redound upon our ill because other people will react against us. In the same way that if you put something horrible around your neck, other people are going to react against you. And there's going to be that kind of humiliation or even danger. So we might call this ottappa something like an idea of self-protection, of realizing that there's an external danger as well as an internal danger. We understand that the wise, the Buddha likes a lot to refer to the wise, the opinions of the wise. And if we understand that the opinions of the wise are that these kinds of thoughts are not to our benefit, then we should pay attention to those. We should pay attention to the fact that there are dangers in these ways of thinking, and sometimes contemplating these dangers and contemplating the problems that they might have to us will help to diminish their power within our mind stream while we're trying to do meditation. Third, the Buddha suggests we try to forget them or not pay attention to these thoughts. And here the Buddha gives the simile of somebody who is well-sighted, who can see very well, but there's something in front of them that they don't want to see. He says that they would either close their eyes or perhaps turn away. These are ways that we can talk about guarding the sense doors, is one of the expressions that's sometimes used in early Buddhism. And here, we're quite literally guarding the sense doors in the sense that we're saying just forget about them and don't pay attention to them. And this word forget about them is actually in Pali the word asati, which means to be unmindful of them. To actually not perform mindful meditation, if you like, I mean, that's at least a connotation here, is that we withdraw our tendency to be mindful, or we don't follow the instruction to be mindful to these kinds of thoughts. We simply try to forget them. We try to distract the mind, if we like. Some examples might be to get up and take a walk, or to do the laundry, or do the dishes, or do some kind of activity that takes your mind away from the obsession and into something more concrete, perhaps more diverting, at least in a temporary way, such that when you return to the meditation, those ideas have been forgotten. The fourth technique the Buddha suggests is he says, give attention to the stilling of the formation of such thoughts. And here he gives the simile of a person who is walking very fast. The person who's walking fast may suddenly think to themselves, why am I walking fast? And so they slow down. And then he says they may think to themselves, why am I even walking at all? And so they may stop and just remain standing. And then they may think to themselves, why am I even standing? And so they may lie down. And here, what's being suggested is that as you investigate as to why you're making these kinds of efforts, slowly you go from, let's say, a more gross posture, a posture that takes more effort and is more involved in energy and efforting, if you like, towards one that is more subtle, that involves less effort, that is more relaxed, is more calm. And again, the point here, of course, is calming meditation. That's sort of the aim, at least in this set of practices. So looking from a grosser and more efforting kind of practice towards one that is calmer is going to be going in the right direction and going away from these kinds of upsetting kind of obsessions. Now, I think there's some question as to how you would really practice with this. Again, these are all considered advanced practices, so I'm sure people with more advanced meditation practice may have their own ideas. I believe it's the commentary that suggests basically that we ask why we're thinking certain kinds of thoughts. So if something is obsessing our mind, say we're thinking about buying a car or something, and that just keeps coming up and up and up, we consider why that's arising. What is the cause of that? And then we think of the cause of that. In other words, if we think, okay, it's causing because I'm clinging to this car, clinging to the idea of the car, then we think, why am I clinging to this car? Is there something else that I'm missing? And as we sort of go farther and farther back along this chain, so it's suggested in the commentary, I believe, we're going to get to sort of more and more subtle kinds of concerns, farther away from the obsessions that are in front of our minds. And as we get farther away, these will get subtler and subtler, and perhaps we will then relax in that way. I believe Bhikkhu Bodhi's also suggested that we use this as a suggestion to do mindfulness practice, that we return to a kind of mindfulness practice where we're just practicing with the arising and passing of states in the present moment. So rather than, let's say, going down a rabbit hole of trying to think of the causes and conditions, which indeed can get us into the story if we're not careful, if we're simply watching the arising and passing of these kinds of states of obsession in our minds, that slowly they'll decay of their own, as it were, of their own will, as it were. They'll just stop coming up. We're going to just simply watch them arise, watch them decay, watch them arise, watch them decay, and over a period of time, that can sort of denourish these kinds of obsessions. And the Buddha's fifth technique is a pretty shocking one. It is, he says, that with your teeth clenched and your tongue pressed tight against the roof of your mouth, to crush mind with mind. And here he gives the simile. He says like a large, stronger man might hold down and pin down a smaller, weaker man. And so this is the technique that the Buddha suggests as kind of a last resort kind of technique. This is the fifth out of 5. And I think we can see here why this would be a problem, why this would be something only to be used by people who were skilled at meditation, and frankly why these techniques are best used with relatively modest kinds of obsession. The Buddha himself did say he used this technique when he was still a bodhisattva, before he had become awakened, when he was doing various kinds of extreme mortification, which he believed were not successful and not useful. And this was one of these kinds of extreme mortification. However, since it arises here as well as successful meditation, it seems that the Buddha is basically saying to us that this is a technique that is not useful, not successful, except in extreme cases. In extreme cases, if nothing else works, then perhaps you can try to suppress mind with mind, just, push it all down. Now, the advanced meditation teachers I know and have talked with and heard about have said, I think universally, that this technique doesn't work. So there's a question, I think, in our minds as to whether the Buddha was serious about this, as to perhaps the Buddha was obviously being awakened. Perhaps he was more successful than the most successful meditation teachers I've ever seen, so maybe he had something on them here. But nevertheless, this is a technique that at least the Buddha suggests in extreme cases. And these are for meditators who are, in the Buddha's words, pursuing the higher mind. That is, they're advanced meditators who are really farther along the path than sort of people in the introductory levels. Now, the question arises, why do I say that these are advanced techniques? I mean, some of them seem relatively benign, substituting one kind of mental thought for another, doing metta when you're angry. These are kinds of things that are suggested willy-nilly for virtually everybody. And that's true to some extent. It's clear that some of them are less advanced than others, or at least can be used in conditions that are less advanced. But the problem here, I think, is pretty deep, which is that any of these techniques can become a version of what's called spiritual bypassing. And I did a video on that, which I'll put up here in a link here on the screen if you're not familiar with that phrase. But basically the idea is that it's very easy for us, if we don't like a kind of thought, if a kind of thought embarrasses us or hurts us or makes us feel lesser about ourselves, that we push it away from our minds, that we don't want to pay attention to it. And there are lots and lots of techniques we use without thinking to reject our own thoughts in one way or another. And indeed, this list of 5 are 5 ways that I think typically people use to suppress thoughts that they don't like. And that's not a good practice in general. And it certainly is not a good practice when you're just starting out. Because if you're going to suppress these thoughts all the time, then you're never really going to come into contact with them. You're never going to confront them. You're never really going to figure out where they come from. Because if you're always suppressing them, then you're really never looking at them and never taking account of them. Which is why, when you practice with these, which I imagine some of you may, that you always give yourself time to also use a mindfulness technique where you're allowing them to rise and simply being with them. Because it's only by being with them and seeing them for a period of time that you're really able to, I think, work with them in the most effective way that will lead them in the longer term not to return, or at least to return less and less and less. If you're always suppressing them in some degree, you're always going to be stuck with them coming back in some form or another with the same kind of strength, I think. I mean, at least that's my experience with these. Now, also, it's quite possible that these are intended to be relatively minor kinds of obsessions, the kinds of things that may obsess your mind for a day or maybe a couple of days, and then they go away of their own. It's less important then. The problem arises when we use these for obsessions that, or concerns or hatreds, angers, or desires that persist over days, weeks, months, then pushing these things down is really not going to be an effective practice. For your advanced practitioners who've been through that and have gotten to a stage where these obsessions are really relatively minor, then yes, these techniques I think could be probably more effective. So if you find these approaches useful in your practice, share them with other people you think might be interested, or give it a thumbs up. I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.